Dr. Svetlana Shtrom is currently directing commercial development of technologies at UCF. Svetlana has extensive experience in business development and technology management. She has broad expertise in collaborative partnership structuring, strategic planning, market assessment, technology evaluation, and intellectual property management. Svetlana's business development experience includes leadership roles in academia, government, and industry. Svetlana holds an MBA from UCF. She has a postdoctoral fellow at National Institutes of Health and received a PhD in cell biology from University of California at San Francisco and a BS in molecular genetics from Ohio State University. Svetlana also serves on the board of directors for BioFlorida. Please give a warm welcome to Svetlana Shtrom.
Thank you, Tamaria. Really appreciate it. And thank you, Jennifer and Celeste, for this wonderful opportunity to present. I am super honored to be a part of FRAC this year and look forward to interacting with all of you. So we'll get started. Let's go to slide 2, please. Okay, so I divided today's presentation into 2 sections. I wanted to focus at first on intellectual property and technology transfer, and then talk about how intellectual property terms and sponsored contracts impact technology transfer and the opportunities for licensing. So we'll keep going. Slide 3, please. So let's talk about technology transfer. What does our office do? We protect, market, and license universities' intellectual property. We manage all of the intellectual property that is developed at the university by researchers, students, and even staff. We transfer that technology, transfer the rights to that technology to companies, investors, and entrepreneurs to get the technology into the marketplace. We interface with industry and investors and entrepreneurs to get that technology out the door. We negotiate a variety of partnership agreements. We also do a number of different educational workshops on intellectual property, technology, commercialization, and entrepreneurship. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to cover some of the intellectual property basics. There are 4 ways in which intellectual property can be protected, or 4 types of protections that are offered. Protection can be gained through patenting. And patents basically confer the right to exclude others from making, using, offering for sale, or selling the invention itself. Also, intellectual property can be protected by trademarking or obtaining trademarks, which protect words, names, symbols, and they basically identify the unique source from which the products are made, or the companies that make the products. Another way that intellectual property can be protected is through copyrights. Copyrights protect works of authorship that are recorded in a tangible medium. One interesting quick thing I'll say about copyrights is that copyright protection is available as soon as a work is created. We often hear in our area, our researchers will contact us and they'll say, quick, I have to get this copyrighted so that I can present. So the actual copyright protection already exists as soon as the work is made. But what we can do is obtain extra protection by registering copyrights with the Library of Congress. So I just wanted to put that out there in case you get somebody stressed out coming to you saying, I gotta protect my copyright. There's not really kind of necessarily a rush or a deadline to do it. It's better to do it sooner, to register the copyright sooner, because it gives you more protection under the law, but the basic protection already exists. And then trade secrets is the 4th way that intellectual property can be protected. And trade secrets protect intellectual property really by virtue of secrecy. There's not a way that in which a trade secret can be filed somewhere with the government to say, okay, this is officially our trade secret and we want it protected. It's really protected by virtue of secrecy and confidentiality in keeping others, basically limiting access to that information. So those are the 4 main ways. By far, most of the intellectual property that we receive in our office is patentable. So we obtain patents We do have a number of copyrightable works and software that we protect through copyright registration. We also occasionally do trademarks. Most of the time, the trademarks are associated with the patent or the copyright, and it's just a name given to that particular product. We don't often have trademarks that are kind of out by themselves. So most of the time they are associated with a product, but sometimes we'll have isolated trademarks. And we do very few trade secrets. It's very hard for a large university to keep anything secret. So we discourage that method. You know, some of the kind of commonly known trade secrets are the formula, the Coca-Cola formula. You know, a lot of people give that as an example, and that's protected by virtue of very limited access to that information. As a university, it would be very difficult for us to maintain something, continue to use it, but not release it, you know, to the public. So it's hard to maintain it as a trade secret. So we talked about, you know, that intellectual property basically offers a way to protect certain technologies or attributes of technologies. So why is it important? Why not just let the researchers publish everything, put everything in a public domain, and kind of be done with that? Well, the reason we really want to protect it is because there's value in protecting intellectual property. By protecting it, we're able to have exclusivity. So I mentioned that patents confer the right to exclude others. So if you patent something, then nobody else can do exactly the same thing. So that means only you, the owner, can do it, but you can also convey those rights to your partner. So you can convey that exclusivity to a commercial partner. And so that in turn incentivizes commercialization. So when we give rights to a company to a particular set of technologies, then only that company has the rights, which means they're more willing to spend the time, the effort, and expand resources needed to commercialize the technology, because they know others can't jump in. If we put everything into the public domain, then really anybody can pick up that technology and build on it. And so that doesn't incentivize the commercial partners to really put the effort in commercializing those technologies. And by going ahead with the commercialization process and providing that exclusivity and incentivizing commercialization, we generate value. And so the next two slides will just show just how much value there can be in licensing university developed intellectual property. So next slide, please. Thank you. This slide is a little bit dated, but I couldn't find any more recent information on some of the big blockbusters. So this slide is just showing, like I said, I wanted to show how much value there is in intellectual property that's developed from universities and licensed to corporations. And so back as of 2016, you can see kind of the cumulative amounts that some of these universities were able to make. So at the top is Northwestern with Lyrica. And at that time, it generated 1.3 billion. I think I saw a more recent figure of $2 billion that drug brought into the university. And then you can see all these different other universities and the different products that they have had commercialized and the amount of money that they brought in. Most of the products are in the clinical, in the life science space. There are a couple of exceptions here. Carnegie Mellon has a disk drive noise reduction system, but that money, you can say with the asterisk, that came in through a lawsuit for infringement and not really through conventional licensing. But, and so they actually made a big splash with that kind of lawsuit and going after companies and suing them, which of course universities don't like to do, but it worked out okay for them, as you can see. Another exception to kind of the standard path is Stanford's revenue that they've generated from Google. That came in as an equity investment that the university received in fostering that spin out and not the traditional kind of licensing path. But anyways, you could see that there's large amounts of money to be made. And then I have a more updated slide on, next slide, please, on top 10 universities based on licensing revenue income. And this is from Autumn, and it's it's based on the data for the most recent year that Autumn has published, which is 2018. And you can see City of Hope is at the top. They have technology that enables genes to be put into DNA and taken out. It's some of the very kind of early pioneering technology to insert fragments of DNA into other larger pieces of DNA. So it's a very commonly used technology. You can see they brought in lots and lots of money. We can see Northwestern, which is still there and I showed it in the prior slide. And University of California reports their data as an entire system. They don't break it out by different universities. And so, of course, they have a very large amount of money that they bring in. I think all of the schools on this list have medical schools, and it generally tends to be that a lot of the high value licensing deals come in through clinical products or like life science related products. So anyway, so I just wanted to illustrate that there's a lot of money that can be made through technology transfer, through licensing inventions. And so kind of where does that money go? What happens to it? So we'll talk about that in the next slide, please. So this is what I'm showing is the distribution of licensing income at UCF. It's very similar to kind of what other universities do. I do want to point out that for any technology that's developed with federal funding and licensed, under the law, under Bayh-Dole, we are required to invest back a majority of that income into the research enterprise. So you can see UCF's general distribution is we have 3 tiers, and in the first year of the first 100,000 that we collect, 50% is shared among the inventors and creators, 20% goes to the colleges of those inventors and creators, 20% to the departments, and 10% is retained by the research foundation. And you can see the sliding scale. Most universities have similar distributions. Anywhere from 30 to 50% of the income that comes in is distributed to the inventors, which, by the way, also is part of the Bayh-Dole. Bayh-Dole does stipulate that the inventors are supposed to receive a portion of the revenue that's generated from licensing of the inventions that they develop. So basically, we use this also to incentivize our researchers to work with us and to get the technologies out the door, because they actually stand to benefit personally through these distributions. That I don't want to take a lot of time on this. I just want to mention very quickly that there are some conflict of interest considerations that also have to be kind of put into place. And, because the inventors stand to benefit personally, at least for us, we tend to negotiate deals with companies for intellectual property licensing at arm's length. We don't involve the inventors and the creators in those discussions because of the conflict of interest that's created with the money coming into them in their personal capacity. So I just wanted to mention that. Okay, we'll jump ahead and next slide, please. And so, so I'd like to talk about the path for commercializing these technologies. This is my general diagram, and then I'm going to break it into pieces and kind of go through this flow chart in a little more detail. So you'll see that slide, and then you'll see portions of it highlighted as I go through the different steps. So next slide, please. So we'll start out looking at the first 2 steps, an invention or a work disclosure describing invention or work comes into our office, and we assess various aspects of that intellectual property. I do want to really just quickly as a side point say again, under the law, under Bayh-Dole, as it was recently amended, for any university that's receiving federal funding and under any contract, under an award with a federal agency, we are required to ensure that all of the recipients, all of the PIs or all of the researchers working on that award have an obligation to disclose intellectual property to the university and an obligation to assign. That's a newly amended version of Bayh-Dole. Was amended in 2018. So I just wanted to mention it because I just want to make sure everybody understands that the researchers have to, generally for all universities, have to disclose intellectual property that's developed and have to assign it to the employer, to the university. Okay, we'll jump ahead to the next slide. So as an invention or work is submitted to the technology transfer office, we do an assessment of that technology. So we look at the regulatory requirements. So I mentioned Bayh-Dole, and I mentioned that the researchers have to submit the invention disclosures to us. and they have to assign them. And so we also have an obligation under Bayh-Dole, which is a federal law, to report any inventions that have come in that have arisen under federal funding to the government. And there's a special portal called iEdison through which we do that. Or for some of the sponsoring agencies, we report directly to them. But anyways, we're obligated to report inventions, and we're also obligated to provide a confirmatory license to the government stating that by virtue of federal funding, the government has certain rights in these technologies. So we do that. For inventions that arise out of private funding or industry funding, we may still have obligations to inform. We typically do have obligations to inform the sponsor. So we do all of that. And then we look at the technology and we look to see how novel is it? How broadly can we protect it? Does it really offer an advantage over technologies that are already out there that other companies are using or that are in the public domain? We look to see what is the market for that technology. We do talk to our researchers to see if they need additional funding. We work with our proposal development team to see if we can identify opportunities that can enhance the funding that the faculty receive in order to expand the research or continue to do research on this particular technology. We also had a pilot gap fund that we started to operate, and then the economy kind of shrank, the budgets shrank with the pandemic that we have, so we haven't been able to go back and expand on that program, but we did go through one round of the gap fund awards. And so that money, it was coming in from our research foundation, derived from some of the income that we've brought in through licensing. And it was money that we gave to laboratories with whom we already had some intellectual property that we were working on. And the idea was to do some proof of principle validation studies, create a prototype to take that technology to the next level so that we can attract industry attention. So we do work with our researchers to help them identify various funding sources. And then we start to think through what is the best way to protect the technology. We talked about patents, copyrights, and trademarks. There are different forms of protection, and that depending what the invention is and the best way to protect it, that we would choose the right path. Patents really create methods of doing something, the compositions of things, and copyrights are more for capturing the work itself as it is. It's not a method of creating something. It's not an ongoing process that can be changed. Copyright protects exactly the thing that's created. So it's really different. We can copyright software code, but if there's an algorithm for calculating something a certain way or processing information a certain way, that's something that would be patentable. So we try to protect it as broadly as possible. I mentioned too, if there's a catchy name that goes along with it, we would try to trademark that as well. And so we start to work with our researchers to establish what's the best commercialization path. Is the faculty member, him or herself, or the postdoc or student, are they interested in starting a company? We can help to facilitate that. Or is it better to license this technology to an external company that already has a pipeline of related technologies that can really commercialize that more quickly? So we start to have that conversation with our inventors to see what is the best path to market. Next slide, please. So we also have a technology commercialization committee that reviews these technologies. So as we do this assessment that I just described, we present that to our technology commercialization committee, which meets monthly. The committee consists mostly of technology transfer professionals. We do bring in subject matter experts or entrepreneurs, various other people involved in the commercialization process to help us make these decisions. And the committee reviews the technology and makes a decision on behalf of the university if the university should take title to it, or if we should pass. And sort of pass kind of has different layers to it. Sometimes there's just not enough data, and the investigators indicate that they're going to do additional studies and they think that they're going to have more data soon. We would then put it kind of on hold and say, please come back to us when you have more data, and we'll reconsider it, but we're not ready to move forward with it at this time. Other times we decide that we're not going to pursue it. And so if it's federally funded, we then waive the rights to the government. If it's not federally funded, we can actually waive the university's rights to the inventors, or we can just abandon it. So we inform the inventors of the decision. And then make the kind of the right decision after that. If the inventors want the rights, they request them and we waive it to them. And if we decide to move forward and actually take title to the technology, we, of course, update the government that we're taking title, and then we do a much deeper dive, which I'll describe in the next slide. So next slide, please. Next one. Thank you. So then we do a deeper dive and look at it more in more detail at the market and business analysis and the opportunities to get this technology commercialized. So we look at the market size, we look at the competitive landscape, we look to see who else is working in a similar space, because they can be competitors, but they may also be partners who are interested in licensing this technology. We look at the industry itself. What are the barriers to entry? What would be the regulatory path? Of course, for life science technologies, there's a more complicated and longer development path, looking at FDA regulations and how to get market approval and all of that. We think through kind of what is it going to take and who's in the best position to take that technology forward. We look at the stage of the development. I mentioned the gap fund to help to prototype some things. We look to see how committed are the inventors to continuing to work on it. Are they committed enough that if we start to bring industry interested parties to the table, will they take the time to help to explain it, help to facilitate some of these conversations with industry? So all of that helps. Because if we don't have cooperative inventors, we really will not be able to take the technology further, mostly because a lot of the technology that we see is very early stage. So it requires it requires additional development and continual discussions with the inventors. So if they're not really available, that really limits our opportunity to transfer that technology to industry. We look at the funding needs. Maybe we can help with some of the small business opportunity grants, matching funds, identify investors that may be interested in spinning out a company around this particular technology. We also have the I-Corps program, which is, it started out originally as an NSF program. It stands for Innovation Corps, and we have a grant from NSF to do some of this early business opportunity vetting. That's what the I-Corps program is for. And so we can really look through that I-Corps training, we're able to form teams, which typically involve the researcher where the technology is developed, a student or a postdoc who kind of will do a lot of the legwork in assessing the business opportunity, and an experienced mentor who can help guide the process. And through this I-Corps program, the laboratory can really check to, really identify what is the best business model to take the technology forward, who would be the customers, and then really reach out to these customers and get customer feedback to see if we can really validate that the technology is solving a problem. Is it really a solution to a problem? And then is there a market fit? Is there an opportunity to get this technology out the door? So we do all of that as part of our assessment. Next slide, please. So after all of these different layers of assessments that I mentioned, we come to the point of really determining what is the right commercialization strategy. I mentioned that a lot of these technologies are very early stage, and so oftentimes startup is the right opportunity because if we can continue to have the laboratory experience in moving the technology forward, we would want to rely on that. Hopefully we have either the faculty member or a student or a postdoc who is interested in leading the effort of the startup. And then we have other resources in the university. We have an incubation program that can provide coaching and mentoring. So we have a way to get this technology commercialized through a startup. And then other times the best opportunity is to find an external existing company that can easily add this to their pipeline of technologies and very quickly commercialize the technology that we have. So it really just depends on the right kind of resources and the right technology. And so we pick the best partner that we can find for the technology and move it forward, getting it to market. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to highlight kind of some of our accomplishments in 2020. We are improving our ranking in patents. And those rankings are very much based on just the number of patents. And so it doesn't necessarily reflect the quality or the commercialization potential of those patents, but it is something that's kind of out there that a lot of universities put out, is where do they rank in their patents. And it's the number of patents is very much a reflection of the budget that a technology transfer office has to work with. So we've had some constrictions in our budgets, and so we've had kind of the numbers go down. Now we're starting to ramp up the numbers of patents, so hopefully that will continue to grow. We also were selected last year for AUTUM. AUTUM is, they don't like to spell out the acronym anymore. They just want to be known as AUTUM, but they were formerly known as Association of University Technology Managers. It's a big trade organization that kind of speaks and harnesses the power of technology transfer, and they collect a lot of data. And so we were actually nominated for their inaugural Better World Project Award for our Bold and Gold stormwater purification media. This is one of those examples where we did get a trademark for Bold and Gold, and we have this purification media that cleans stormwater runoff and obviously helps the environment by taking impurities out of the water. We also launched a partnership with Sanofi, which is very exciting for us, and we're looking forward to growing that partnership. We have overall 13 fellows that have been inducted into the National Academy of Inventors. And back in 2017, we were ranked 22nd in the nation for our technology transfer capabilities. So we were very proud of that. So these are just some of our highlights. And so we'll move on to the next slide, please. So I'm approaching the end of my first portion of the presentation on intellectual property and technology transfer. So just to summarize that, how do we get valuable research results into the marketplace and get them commercialized as products that really have an impact on society? So the key drivers of technology commercialization is really, first of all, having valuable intellectual property. We already talked about that there's a lot of value to be made, and the intellectual property has to be protected. We talked about exclusivity. It's really critical to be able to convey rights to our commercial partner, to give that commercial partner an advantage over other companies. So that for that, you really need to have exclusivity. And so we want to find optimal commercialization partners. We talked about how sometimes it's a small company, sometimes it's an existing industry. It's whichever entity is willing to put in the right resources to commercialize this particular technology. That's who is the right partner for that effort. And we really want to be effective in transferring that technology, be successful and effective in what we do, and to really be able to illustrate mutual benefit, so benefit to the university and the benefit to the commercial partner, and the opportunity to create impactful products. So the one thing I want to circle back to on this slide is, because the rest of it is really I'm going to really talk about intellectual property and in making sure we have the full capability to harness the benefit of that intellectual property. So we want it to be broad, and we want to have it protected well, and we want to be able to convey that exclusivity to our commercial partner. I keep emphasizing that because you'll see kind of where we're going with that. So next slide, please. So this is a technology transfer lifecycle. We borrowed this this diagram from AUTUM with their permission. So everything we've talked about so far pretty much picks up with the invention at kind of like 1 o'clock, and goes through the cycle, ending with public use and economic growth and everything we were just talking about. What we haven't talked about is what's upstream of that, the research and development, which is where, of course, all of us are, we're all in research administration, and that's where our interests are, and that's where we spend a whole lot of our time and effort in helping our researchers in getting the most out of the research experience and fostering and facilitating that program. So research and development is upstream of technology transfer, and so the the intellectual property terms, the contracts that are negotiated through research and development really impact the rest of the cycle, really impact what type of intellectual property is available and what encumbrances exist based on the contracts that are negotiated during the research and development phase. Next slide, please. So I know I just have a circle around it. So that's really what we're going to talk about is the basically sponsored research IP terms and how they then impact the downstream things that we've been talking about now, which is technology commercialization. So next slide, please. Okay, pretty much I just said that we're going to talk about IP terms and sponsored contracts. So we'll jump to the next slide. Thank you, Elizabeth. So what I want to talk about is really comparing different ways in which, so different terms that we can put into research contracts and different ways that we can engage industry and what has worked well and what are some of the kind of the problems that we've encountered and other universities have encountered. So I'd like to compare the traditional approaches versus some of the industry partnership or some of the company-friendly approaches that universities have rolled out, hoping to solve some of the problems that we have in engaging industry and finding the right contractual terms to make the relationships work. So I'll start with the traditional approach, and I'll talk about some of the company-friendly approaches that other universities have rolled out, including us as well. So the traditional approach, what we call sometimes the neutral position, is, ours, theirs, joint, the people have different catchphrases for it. But basically the traditional approach is that each party retains rights to their background intellectual property, which is intellectual property that that exists prior to the start of the collaborative research, or is developed outside of the collaborative research project in parallel with it. So everybody keeps their own background IP. Foreground IP developed by each party is owned by that party. A lot of times we use the catchphrase that ownership follows inventorship. So whoever invents intellectual property, the employer of those researchers, would own that foreground intellectual property. Jointly developed intellectual property is jointly owned. So very kind of neutral, very simple structure. So, so what would licensing kind of terms look like under that setup? Oftentimes, we can offer a time-limited option to negotiate a commercial license. So for example, we would report an invention to the industry partner. They'll have 6 months to review it and to let us know if they would like to enter into a license agreement. So there's very little obligation here. There's just a time-limited opportunity. We basically say we'll negotiate a commercial license. We're not spelling out any terms. We're not really putting any obligations. We're just kind of saying, we'll let you know when IP comes out. You let us know if you want it and we'll talk. Once in a while, companies really want to be able to automatically have rights to use that intellectual property, at least for their internal purposes. So we can do that because that doesn't really limit our ability to still do commercial licenses after that, because we're limiting their use to non-commercial internal purposes. And occasionally companies really absolutely insist, and it's a deal breaker if they don't get it, that they want to have commercial non-exclusive rights, like very kind of their bare bones, bare bottom. We have to have at least this or we walk away. So, occasionally we grant that, but it's not ideal. So a lot of times these things are called NERFs. They're non-exclusive royalty-free licenses to the foreground IP. And I mentioned here, I'll go into more detail, I think in the next slide, why they're not so desirable. Because once you give out a commercial NERF, you really don't have an opportunity to give exclusivity to anybody else because you have a non-exclusive already granted. And we talked about the value of being able to provide exclusivity to commercial partners. So NERFs aren't great, but they can get you to lock in a deal. So occasionally we go ahead and agree to that. So next slide, please. So, and I know all of you in research administration already have heard this, if you had a nickel for every one of these complaints that I'm showing on the slide, we'll all be enjoying an expensive lunch right now. So basically the companies don't like the traditional approach because, first of all, when they even enter into a discussion of sponsoring research, their presumption is they're going to own all the intellectual property that comes out of it. They can't even fathom any alternative because they're coming in, they're paying for the research, they're going to own the IP. So oftentimes we're starting out in very opposite sides of this negotiation spectrum. The company says, we are sponsoring research, we're going to own everything. We're coming in going, well, no, IP has to have a different royalty stream. No, you don't get the IP. You're paying for the research, but you have to pay for IP separately. And I know those of you who live and breathe this stuff, you know, it's a really large gap that you have to fill. And you know, come much closer to mutual understanding, and it's not easy. So first of all, the company wants to own all of foreground IP, but that's not enough. They also want to own or have rights to whatever background IP the university is bringing into the collaboration that they need in order to practice the foreground IP. They don't want to pay any additional consideration. We just talked about that, but they want to have it all kind of wrapped up in one agreement. And in general, they really don't want to have the risk of us developing something really valuable and important to their research program, to their products, that we later can kind of hold them hostage and say, okay, we've got this IP, it's super great. You're going to need it, you're going to want it, and we're going to want a whole lot of money for it. And so they don't want to have that risk of not being able to use the technology that's developed with their funding. And so, you know, so we talked about kind of ideally they want to own it all, they want the background, they want all this stuff, but at the very least, they want the freedom to operate, and which I kind of mentioned on the previous slide. And so they insist at the very, very least, they want to have a non-exclusive royalty-free license. So, and I mentioned that I will go into more detail on in this slide as to why we don't like that. I already mentioned on a previous slide that granting a non-exclusive prevents us from being able to grant a royalty-bearing, nice, lucrative, exclusive license. So these NERFs, they don't generate value, they don't really incentivize commercialization, and they don't allow us, to get a nice exclusive deal. So they're not great, but we sometimes have to give in to that in order to even get the deal done. Next slide, please. So with with that background, whether we talked about the traditional way of doing things, we talked about how companies object to the traditional way of doing it. So how do we close that gap? So a number of universities a while back decided to create a variety of company-friendly approaches that they wanted to kind of market and announce that they had these better ways of doing things, better than the traditional way. They're much more forward-thinking. They want to do things differently. And so they laid out different opportunities. So some of the industry partnering or company-friendly IP approaches include basically putting in pre-negotiated commercial licensing terms or commercial rights into the sponsored research agreements in order to foster that interaction with private industry. So basically, I'm just kind of like going through the different IP things, and then we'll talk about licensing things, and then we'll get into more detail. So these company-friendly approaches, like I said, include really dispensation of certain rights to foreground IP. They almost always include a carve-out for the university to retain rights to use that IP for their own academic and teaching and research purposes. More recently, universities started to expand that reservation of rights to include additional sponsored research with other private companies. And the companies don't like that, but I'm just saying we push for that. We push to be allowed to use that with other partners. And we also want to carve out the opportunity to use the technology for additional clinical research. So I just threw that kind of in there. Also for these industry-friendly types of opportunities, they typically don't include rights to background IP. And the reason for that is because background IP already pre-existed. It wasn't developed with sponsors funding. It has value. It's not something that we want to create an encumbrance around for all the reasons we mentioned before, because we want to be able to commercialize that and we want to have exclusivity. We don't want to have other encumbrances on that background IP. So typically we don't include that in these special options, special licensing opportunities. And then we typically ask the sponsor to pay for intellectual property protection expenses because that allows us to keep that cycle of intellectual property protection going. So in terms of licensing terms, or licensing language, what does that kind of look like in a sponsored research agreement? So a kind of I would say more unstructured, pre-negotiated set of terms, or maybe I should call it like more case specific, would be just basically pre-negotiating terms for under a specific agreement that could change. If it'd be one set of terms with one partner, it could be a different set of terms with a different partner, but it would generally include some sort of a range for what the royalties would look like, what would the fee structure look like. So it'll just talk about some basic licensing terms, and those would be kind of the floor and the ceiling will be set inside the research agreement for what these terms would look like. Sometimes it could actually have a full set of like a term sheet for a license embedded into the sponsored research agreement. It just depends what the company wants and what the university is willing to give. But still, those terms would kind of vary. Then there's the next two that I want to mention are the kind that's pretty much offered universally to all sponsors. So it would be a set of kind of predetermined conditions that is just available to any kind of industry sponsor to take advantage of. And so these are automatic kind of licensing options where for an upfront fee, a company can receive certain rights to intellectual property that's developed in a sponsored research agreement. And another way to basically to convey rights through a sponsored research agreement is basically to agree to assign ownership to the company for different levels of kind of consideration. So what I have on the next slide, please. On the next slide, I'm summarizing what some of the different universities developed over the years. And I'm really going to focus on the top two because they were the most innovative and the most kind of different approaches, and everybody else is a little bit in between. So I want to cover those, and I'll talk about us and our experience, and we can kind of talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly that comes out of all of that. So around 2011 or so, University of Minnesota really launched something very innovative. And they had this innovative partnership model that their sponsored programs office ran. And they basically, I'm going to ignore the first column for just a second because they added that later. But what they rolled out is this opportunity for industry partners to pay an upfront fee and to get an option to an exclusive license that really didn't have a whole lot of other financial constraints. So once they pay that fee, they pretty much are kind of prepaying for a license. And so the fee was 10% of the value of the contract, or $15,000, whichever is greater. That's important, whichever is greater. And then there were no additional royalties or any other kind of fees except for a Blockbuster Clause, which I have kind of listed in the last column. And what that is sometimes it's called Bonanza Clause or Blockbuster. So if a company is very successful selling a particular product developed by the university, and if they sell $20 million if they generate $20 million in revenue in any given year, they'll pay 1% of that amount to the university. So it's a 1% royalty. Excuse me. And so that just gave the university some kind of revenue to get back, because otherwise we're kind of pre-selling intellectual property for 10% or 15,000. So something is super great and really successful, you still have that 1% kind of coming in, the possibility of getting that 1%. So that was the University of Minnesota's program. And it was basically, they only had two choices that it was option A was the one we just described. And option B was the traditional approach that they'll negotiate a license, royalty bearing license when the IP is developed. And they marketed it and it was very successful, and they've done well with it. And I'll kind of talk about that in more detail. And more recently, they've added a non-exclusive option to this menu. And that goes back to kind of what I was saying, that companies, at the very least, they want to have the non-exclusive right and the freedom to operate. And they want it for free. And so what Minnesota did that was really nice is that they added it to their menu. And that kind of already ensures that people aren't thinking the companies aren't thinking they're going to get it for free. They already can see that there's already value assigned to it. And so now Minnesota has three choices that they offer. So they still kept the same A and B, they just added a C, which is the non-exclusive option. and that's for 10% of the value of the contract. So you may remember I was saying with their option A, it's 10% or 15,000, whichever is greater, and it has the Blockbuster clause. Their latest option, the non-exclusive, I don't believe it has the Blockbuster clause, but it definitely doesn't have a minimum of 15,000, so it's just 10%. So they added that. So I'm going to jump to Penn State, and then we'll kind of talk about a few of the in-between things. So around the same time, Penn State came out with a very drastically different model and said they are not going to take ownership in intellectual property developed through industry contracts. So they're basically going to assign all intellectual property that's developed to the sponsor, to the industry partner, and just for free. That's the important part, for free. And so they also made this big splash with this, big announcements, and a lot of kind of promotional items or promotional discussions coming out of this. And so because this was kind of broadly known, I'm going to kind of jump to us. So our senior management heard about these different opportunities through various conferences that they attended, and kind of came back to us and said, okay, we get complaints from industry that it's difficult to negotiate IP terms. We want you to come up with some sort of a menu of options as well. So we looked at those, and this is back at Jennifer Shamberg and I and our general counsel. We all kind of put our heads together, and we basically decided to kind of combine these things. So we pretty much took everything that Minnesota had. Now back, at that time they didn't have the non-exclusive, so we didn't have the non-exclusive, but we took their option A as written, and then we added our own option B, which was like Penn State, but it wasn't free because it doesn't make sense to charge for a license and then give ownership for free. So we made our option B twice the amount. So our option A is the 10% value of the contract, or 15,000, whichever is greater. Then we added option B that we will assign ownership for 20% upfront fee, 20% of the value of the contract, or 30,000. We had the blockbuster clauses in both of those options. And then our option C is the traditional, we'll negotiate later kind of a deal. So I actually have that outlined in the next slide. But before we go, sorry, Elizabeth, hold on. So I just want to say that a bunch of universities kind of followed suit and you can see it from this table, various, kind of different portions of these or different combinations of things. I think almost all universities ask the sponsor to pay for intellectual property costs. Of course, that's needed. I do show that a couple of universities offer the non-exclusive, the NERF that I mentioned. They offer it for free. That's not kind of my favorite position, but some of them do. Anyway, so kind of back to us. I will show you on the next slide where we are. But why don't we go ahead, Elizabeth, go ahead to the next slide, and I'll mention that we too are working on including a non-exclusive choice as well. So this is, I know it's kind of small probably for you. This is our flyer advertising our industry-sponsored innovation partnership program. I already kind of described options A and B. C is just traditional. We are working on, we're going to rename the options, but we're going to add a non-exclusive one that offers, prepayment for a non-exclusive royalty-free license. So I think the advantage of that, like I said, is that the companies aren't going to ask for it for free. Well, they'll still ask, but we'll at least have it on the menu as something that they can pay for. And I believe our intent is to ask for 5% of the total value of the contract for the non-exclusive. And so you can see kind of how it's laid out, that by prepaying, there are no additional fees that will be due except for the Blockbuster clause. No kind of milestones, no other. So it really simplifies what we're asking for under these arrangements. What we do get a prepayment. There's some really important details at the bottom, which I don't know if you can see because it's kind of small, so I'll try to run through them. So first of all, when we say 10% or 20%, what is that of? And we say kind of total value of the contract. So that means direct and full appropriate indirect rates that would otherwise apply. The payment really should be, this is a lesson learned that painful lesson that we learned. The payment really should be an upfront payment. This is how it's designed. Once in a while, companies ask us to break that into kind of increments or installments. It really doesn't work when it comes to intellectual property because the intellectual property can be developed at any time. So, if a company falls behind in payment, it really makes it very difficult to determine how much of the intellectual property did they prepay before they fell behind or before something was, an agreement was terminated. So the intent, just keep that in mind. I'm available to discuss this, kind of offline or whenever you want, but you really want it to be upfront and you want it to be in full. Because that's how it de-risks it for you, the university. And so if there's any federal funding, we cannot assign ownership to a private entity under federal law. So option B is not available. If any federal funding is mixed in with option A, then we do have to have certain diligence milestones because we're required by federal law to make sure the technology is actually being utilized. So there'll be a little more meat to that license. And then background intellectual property is not included at all in any of these options. I think that's it. I think I covered the little notes. So that's kind of our program. Like I said, I'm happy to discuss some of the lessons learned from that. So we'll move forward to the next slide, please. So then, how do the universities measure success of these different programs? Well, certainly increases in amount of industry sponsored funding is a good measure. The revenue from these specific upfront kind of payments also shows that the use of these options and how much money can be made, numbers of sponsored agreements, faster negotiation, IP licenses. All of these things are indicators of that these programs are working. Overall, seeing an increase in industry engagement, improved relationships with industry. I'm sure many of you who are kind of in this research administration area hear, the same things we hear, that, oh, your university is so difficult to work with. So-and-so up north or, down south, whichever direction you go, are so much easier to work with. We can do any agreement with them, those kinds of things. So having some of these options can really maybe smooth the path and make it easier to work with industry. Faculty may have positive feedback knowing that you have kind of these flexible paths. So there's benefits to these things. So having laid out the benchmarks, you would think my next slide is going to go, here are the metrics that everyone's reporting. Well, I scoured the internet for days looking for data. I found very limited data on this, and Elizabeth, we can go to that next slide. Thank you. So what I found is a lot of these things were rolled out, as I mentioned, 2011, 2013, kind of that time frame, and they were big. Everybody's got the big press releases and how industry friendly they are and all of that. But there's very little data on it now. So when I went back and I looked, I have some publications that I'm showing as my sources on the bottom of the slide. It really wasn't easy to find these programs. It wasn't easy to find any kind of outcome other than some quotes here and there. And part of it, I think, it's kind of the dust has settled, so to speak. And you'll see kind of as I go through this that it's nice to have a choice, but it's not an often utilized choice. So let's kind of run through some of the metrics that I was able to gather. So Minnesota definitely feels that it was a great benefit to them. They do have data to show that, or they publicly release data to show that the funding under their program has really increased over the years. They actually say they have more agreements. They've been able to partner with more different companies around their kind of the vicinity of the university than they had before. So they really tout this as a successful program. Penn State, which is really interesting because remember, their option is to give ownership for free. What's better than that? Well, they actually are on record saying it didn't increase the number of agreements or the dollar value of the agreements that they've been able to do with industry, which is super, I think, unexpected and interesting to note. They did, however, say that by virtue of this program, they developed certain templates by which the ownership can be transferred to companies. And so the reliance on those templates increased. So they report having faster negotiation times because they're able to rely on their own templates as a starting point. So that's a great benefit as well. But here's an interesting thing, and I kind of combine this data into one bullet, but a lot of universities who are in this who launch these programs report that by far majority of the time sponsors choose the traditional approach. So all this, I kind of feel like I took you on this journey and here we are, and now I'm saying, most of the time, in our case, 95% of the time, the sponsors, the companies choose, the traditional path, and they don't go down the path of these pre-negotiated options. So then what's the deal? What's the benefit? Well, actually, it's kind of what I've been saying all along, is that having these options, these paths, gets you kind of unclogged, unstuck. So when we remember, I was kind of saying that companies come in and they say, we're going to sponsor research and we expect to own everything. And this way, with our option B, we can say, okay, you can. Here's our option B, prepay 20% or 30,000, whichever is greater, and you can own it. So it's great, because it used to be kind of, we would say, no, we can't give it to you. No, we can't just give away intellectual property. No, we can't wrap it into the sponsored research agreement. You have to negotiate a license. It seems a little unfriendly. They're coming in to negotiate a sponsored research agreement, and you're over here kind of saying, oh, and then you're going to have to negotiate a license sometime later. Not necessarily a great way to kind of have that conversation flow and to secure that relationship and foster that collaboration. So having these different pre-negotiated options really helps to get kind of unstuck. So you want to own it? Great. Here's option B. Let's talk. So you kind of can leapfrog through all that, that enclose the gap that I was talking about earlier. So I think it's helpful in that way. So we'll jump to the next slide. It's my last slide. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, no, second to last, but thank you, Elizabeth. That's the one I wanted. Okay, so then why isn't it the answer to everything? Well, for one thing, that, I mentioned that maybe negotiation times could be faster because we now have these preset terms, and, we have template language, so it should go faster. Well, it doesn't, because rather than this being kind of the non-negotiable platform that, you're kind of, okay, you want this? Great. We have an answer for you. Here are the terms, and it's non-negotiable. Companies don't like that kind of position, non-negotiable. So they start to cherry pick, from these options. Well, I want ownership, but I really want it just for 10%. And I don't want to pay the I don't want the Blockbuster Clause, because, that's just too risky for me. I don't even know what sales figures will be like, and I can't track it. My accountant can't keep track of this stuff. So, there's all these different things that the companies kind of put out there, that still take time, and they're still difficult to negotiate, even though, we've sort of addressed some of the big concerns, or the concerns that they said were big at the onset was IP. We've addressed it, but there's other things. So definitely upfront fees become negotiable because they want to negotiate something. So when you give them that menu, they're going to kind of go, how about 10% or 15,000, whichever's lesser, or stuff like that. They absolutely insist on still having background IP wrapped into it for no additional consideration. Like I said, they don't like blockbuster clauses. IP reimbursement can be kind of like, then they start to pick, do they get to pick their attorneys? There's what's the timing? So there's like kind of other things to negotiate. And then other than IP, there's of course publication, representations and warranties, indemnification, all these other things that are going to take time. So it really, the universities who have implemented these programs really do not say that it has improved negotiation time, other than what I showed for Penn State. So some of the other issues that have come up, how is this upfront fee treated if there's no IP? So if there's IP, then you know who to distribute to, because you have very specific kind of definitions of who's an inventor and who's a creator. Without that, how do you distribute? What do you do with that upfront fee if there's no IP that's developed? How are copyrightable works and software handled? Many of these early university agreements that were put out there really just dealt with subject inventions. And so it took a while for the universities to then incorporate copyrightable works and software. I will say really quickly, for us, we basically say if you're prepaying those options, you get copyrightable. Basically, it's part of our definition of IP, so you get everything, patentable and copyrightable intellectual property. So also data and results. Some of the early kind of traditional agreements that we've had, we just give data and results. We basically say that the company, the industry partner, will have rights to data and results. But if we give that up, then that is really underlying the intellectual property. Then how can we manage intellectual property and own it if we're giving away data and results first? So that's something that needs to be factored in. And then I know I'm running out of time, but an important consideration is how do you roll out this program? Do you roll it out university-wide? Do you exclude, like many universities exclude clinical trial agreements or any kind of College of Medicine related collaborations and funding opportunities? So really kind of, we need to really think through who do we want to be eligible for this? And then we want to make sure that the colleges, departments, and the researchers can opt in and opt out, because the terms, the IP fees are very much reduced from traditional IP terms. And so that impacts, of course, the college share, the department share, and the individual's share. So they need to be able to opt in. And so a lot of universities have developed participation agreements that researchers and even departmental level and college level administrators sign to agree to these kind of non-standard terms. And of course, we have to protect the students. A lot of times, as all of you know, you get the money in, the money has, you can hire a student or a postdoc. So then you hire the individual. We have to make sure that those individuals, because the terms are already set, that they too know that their rights are impacted by the set of terms that are underlying the project and the agreement. So it's kind of important to keep that in mind. We'll jump to the last slide. I'm sorry, I'm running over time. I'll try to go through it faster. So we already talked about kind of these initiatives. They can be beneficial for a variety of reasons. First of all, for marketing, you can kind of put it out there and go, we are open for business. We are industry friendly. Look at all the different choices we have. We're here. Welcome, and let's get going. Kind of, you can do marketing campaigns around that. I did talk about in the end what for really to be able to commercialize these valuable research results. The most valuable intellectual property is that which is broad and unencumbered, which is why we don't want to give out non-exclusive, royalty-free licenses up front. It is our responsibility as research administrators to protect the university, the researchers, and the students. So we want to think about the consequences of rolling out some of these programs and making sure, like I said, different units can opt in and opt out. And then basically, technology transfer has a lot of good things that it can contribute. And, we all have to work together to optimize that intellectual property, because it really has the potential to benefit the public, and to bring in additional industry partnerships through the licensing efforts. And, by virtue of that wonderful cycle that we looked at, starting with research and ending with products that impact the society. So I know we're running out of time, but I do believe there's a break built in. I am so sorry for being late. I am done and available for questions. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Svetlana. Currently, I have 4 questions and a comment.
Okay.
First question, is Limitless Solutions a UCF protected IP?
Yes, it is. So Limitless Solutions, they are a direct support organization, which is a defined term under Florida statutes. And so they are part of the university, and their intellectual property, the intellectual property that they develop flows to us. And actually my office, our technology transfer office, works with them and provides a variety of licenses. We manage the trademarks and all that wonderful stuff. So yes, they are part of the university.
Next question. Has the IRS or any other authority provided any guidance on how to maintain a university's tax-exempt status by fulfilling its educational purposes while holding a portfolio of IP considered trade secrets? It seems like trade secret protections are contrary to a university's mission and purpose.
Yeah, so I'm definitely not an expert. It's a great question. I'm not an expert on tax law, but I do know that for the nonprofit status, the traditional kind of royalties is the form that's acceptable, is not considered taxable income and doesn't jeopardize the status. So I know I'm kind of sideways, not really answering exactly the question with trade secrets. I think I'm kind of answering maybe in a different way. So if we were to keep a trade secret and license it and receive revenue for it, it'll still fall under the typical tax kind of exempt nonprofit ways of doing things. There's just so many other reasons why we would not want to do a trade secret. But I think as long as something follows a traditional licensing path, then it still protects the nonprofit status. And if I didn't answer it all the way, please do reach out to me. We can work on the answer because I don't really know that in great detail. I will say one thing though, this question led me to think of something else that I completely did not address in this presentation because I didn't have time. But collecting money up front for intellectual property could have, should be considered, should be looked at, and could have IRS considerations. We do treat that money as a royalty in our case, so we hold it till the project is completed and then, distribute it. And so, for us, we treat it as a royalty, but there are some tax considerations in pre-selling intellectual property that doesn't exist. So I would encourage you all to look at that. And I'm available to point out to some resources that address that. That one of the publications I had from UIDP that I referenced, I know you guys will have slides available to you. That one addresses the business income component of that.
Next question. How would you compare applying for SBIR, STTR versus investing in a startup?
So, well, the SBIR, STTR, they're small business. It stands for Small Business Innovation Research, Small Business Technology Transfer. Those are programs from federal agencies that are available to small businesses. So the answer is they're not mutually exclusive. So I think if I'm getting the question right, that is it. So having those small business programs and having that funding is really a great way to have a startup develop the technology because they're eligible for that money. So rather than going out and looking at looking for investment money, which is really difficult, venture capital, angel, all of that is really difficult. Having the path to fund the company through small business grants is really a great way to go. And so that is oftentimes the reason why we want to spin out a company is because the technology is early stage and it needs additional research. And the best way to get money for that additional research is through the small business program. Angels and VCs, they don't like to fund research. They want to fund something that's further along where the research is already done and now they can see a path to market. So I think the way the question was phrased, I just want to say they're not mutually exclusive. And in fact, because of the small business funding that's available, oftentimes doing a startup is the sensible way to get the technology out.
Our next question, can you speak to advantages or disadvantages of universities transferring IP to related foundations to handle IP licensing versus handling in-house?
Gosh, I'm trying to think how to even answer that. So I guess let me say, so when we say related foundation, so like in our case, intellectual property is held by our University of Central Florida Research Foundation, which is a direct support organization. So I'm not going to count those because that's not really arm's length. So I think the question isn't directed to something like that, which is a university affiliated foundation, because that's just more of a structure. Our research foundation can hold equity. There's just reasons for there's reasons why we want to have the research foundation hold it, but it's not in a kind of an arm's length foundation. So I think maybe some universities would want to choose a foundation that would kind of commercialize on their behalf. I think just because of the expenses that are involved in the, so if the university doesn't have really an ability to set up a tech transfer office and fund it, it's very expensive. Patents are very expensive. I know I was kind of mentioning that our numbers go up and down, but really based on the budget, I mean, we still have the same amount of technology being disclosed to us. We average 100 invention disclosures a year, and that's been pretty steady. The patent numbers go up and down because that's how much money we have to invest into protection. So if the universities really have a very limited resources and want somebody else to kind of take on the risk and share the benefit where they get a smaller percentage, then maybe they would do it through an outside entity. There's also risks with infringements and lawsuits and things. And so maybe having that arm's length relationship balances it out. So you get less revenue, but you take on, it's less work, fewer resources, and less risk. So maybe that's why some of the universities do it. We have not really considered it hopefully I answered that question. If not, reach out to me. But I did want to kind of segment and say that university affiliated foundations, I'm not counting those because they still work really close. I am a member of our research foundation. I work very closely with the research foundation. Our revenue is managed by the research foundation. So I don't consider that to be an outside kind of management entity.
Our next question, does including upfront IP terms in SRAs affect fundamental research exclusion and UBIT considerations?
Okay, wait, I'm sorry. Can just the end, the last part of the question. So I got Ubit, but what was the one before that? The basic research exemption?
Yeah, fundamental research exclusion. Yes.
Exclusion. Boy, I'm not sure. So as far as Ubit, we that's what I kind of touched on earlier, that as long as it's a royalty, as long as and again, I'm not a tax attorney. I'm not the best person to really address all aspects of it on behalf of the university. But I think that as long as something is a royalty, that it's not considered as Ubit and doesn't jeopardize the university nonprofit status. As far as the fundamental research exclusion, to be honest, I'm not sure what that. Yeah, I don't know what exactly is being asked there, like exclusion from what is it? I'm sorry, now I understand the question. Fundamental research exclusion from it being considered Ubit. So really, I think it's how the money is treated. So I think it's still including these licensing terms doesn't really change that it's fundamental research. I think it's really kind of whether it's treated as a royalty. And then, the other consideration, I kind of mentioned it earlier, that really needs to be vetted is assigning value to intellectual property before it's created. That does have some tax consequences, and especially it's a much deeper kind of conversation. It has to do with granting certain rights to industry. And has to do with bonds that are paid for if your building is funded, if the research building is funded through bonds, then there may be an issue with allowing industry to pre-purchase intellectual property. I know it sounds like very different things. It is in that UIDP paper that I referenced. I'm sorry, I'm not an expert on this, but I can just kind of give you enough information to say that you should look it up. But I think the Ubit consideration is not as great because you can treat it as a royalty. The prepaying for IP and the bond issue is a bigger consideration because I've seen that in a number of publications. So please do look at that within your own, kind of with your own attorneys and within your own university structure.
Okay, Svetlana, that was our last question, but we do have a comment.
Okay.
We have found that very often when a company has the option to prepay, they suddenly realize that they may not have any IP and are willing to negotiate an agreement without IP protections included.
Exactly. That is exactly why, I put out that statistic saying 95% of the time when we work with companies, they choose the traditional option. Exactly. When we say, okay, you can prepay this and this. Well, first they try to bargain down the prepayment terms, as I mentioned, but then they kind of go, we don't really want to prepay. We don't know if there's going to be IP and we can negotiate it later. Whereas when they started that conversation, they were adamant about there being IP, them owning it or having it and not really paying kind of any more for it. So I think it's really, it's nice to have these options because it gets the companies thinking. Then they kind of think, well, do we want to pay more? Don't we? Do we really think there's going to be IP? How much do we want to argue over this IP? And that keeps the negotiation moving. So there's that value to this whole kind of pre-negotiated path, because like I said, it just unclogs some of these misconceptions and brings that little gap that we have at the start of the conversation a little closer and gets us closer to the end. So thank you for these great questions.
That was the end of the questions and comments, Svetlana. We want to thank you for all of your hard work on this presentation and giving us this information. Svetlana's contact information is on the screen. I want to remind all attendees we will be providing the handouts and the presentations to all attendees at the end of FRAC. I want to thank you for your participation. Our next session will start at 2:30. That will be award management. Where does the critical thinking fit in? Currently, we have breakout rooms open and available for you to join and network. Thank you again. See you guys back at 2:30.
Thank you.